Welcome to World Affairs Today, brought to you by the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C., a leading forum for global education and international affairs.
Your Excellency, honored guests, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. The Board of Directors of the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C., is pleased to host His Excellency Joao Vale de Almeida this afternoon to speak about an extremely timely subject that has dominated the news for weeks, the European debt crisis and its global implications. In the coming months, the Council will be hosting a series of programs focused on the global economic situation and the implications for the United States. We will keep you all apprised of those events as they are scheduled, and I look forward to seeing you again at some of those programs. Introducing His Excellency and serving today as moderator is the Honorable Joao Campos. Mr. Campos is the National Chair of Locke Lord's Securities Regulation and Enforcement Practice and a partner in that firm. He previously served 2 terms as a commissioner on the Securities and Exchange Commission from 2002 until 2007. During his tenure there, Mr. Campos was responsible for developing many of the SEC's major regulatory initiatives and for 4 years had served as the Commission's liaison to the international community. Mr. Campos began his career as an officer in the United States Air Force and later received his JD from Harvard Law School. He practiced law in Los Angeles as a corporate transaction securities lawyer and then as a federal prosecutor for 5 years. In 2010, he was appointed to President Obama's Intelligence Advisory Board. He will introduce His Excellency and our keynote presentation and also our discussant, Mike Maybach. Both Mr. Campos and Mr. Maybach serve on the Council's Board of Directors. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming the Honorable Joao Campos and our distinguished guests.
I can't think of a more important, more relevant, more current issue today than what is happening in Europe, how our friends across the Atlantic will deal with their own financial crisis, their own debt crisis, and structural crisis, if I could use that term again. And I can't think of a better person to have to explain, to share some of these current events and the thinking of the individuals, the leaders of Europe, better than our guest today, His Excellency Joao Vale de Almeida. He is the head of delegation of the European Union to the United States. In this capacity, he represents the European Commission President José Manuel Barroso and President of the European Council Herman Van Rompuy, under the authority of the High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, Catherine Ashton. An extremely important position. Now, just a few items. He's had a long and distinguished career in diplomacy and in representing the European Union and the European Commission. He is Portuguese, as you can tell from his background. He's a graduate of the University of Lisbon, has a very impressive set of schools that he's gone to. Studied history, I believe, is what we learned. And also, I found this very interesting, studied journalism in the United States and various places across the world. And apparently served as a journalist at one time, which should give him a certain flair for what's important and communication. So with that, I will get out of the way for a few minutes and ask His Excellency to share with us what is happening in Europe, what you can relate to us and communicate about the ongoings, and whether there's a good chance of having some type of resolution that at least Europe is comfortable with.
Well, thank you very much. Pleasure to be here. Congratulations for the World Affairs Council Washington for this initiative and everything that you've been doing. Thanks to you for introducing me so kindly. In about a little less than 1 hour's time, 27 heads of state and government plus the the two European leaders I represent here, will gather in Brussels for the dinner. This will continue throughout the night and tomorrow. And I cannot guarantee when it will be over. What I can guarantee is that this is an important meeting. It will address fundamental issues for the future of the European Union, but I believe fundamental issues for the United States, for the world economy, for the world as such, because the Union is an important partner, an important actor in today's global scene. So whatever happens in Europe, of course, interests people around the world, and first and foremost the United States, because we have across the Atlantic the most relevant, the most important, the most significant economic and political relationship that exists around the planet. So I welcome your interest about the situation in Europe. I understand your interest about the situation in Europe. And what I'll try to do today is not to anticipate what my leaders will decide, who am I to do that, but to try to provide you with a perspective of what is going on in Brussels, why it is happening, and what we are working upon to try to bring solutions to the problems that we face. And my first comment is try to understand why do we have a crisis? And what kind of crisis do we have? I think that the first comment is required is to put this in the perspective of the 2008 financial crisis. Because in fact what we are witnessing are aftershocks of the financial crisis. These aftershocks happen around the world. I didn't see any country immune to the impact of this financial crisis one way or the other. It has affected the US as much as it has affected the European Union. And is still affecting the US as much as it is affecting the European Union. So what is the difference? Why is the European Union on the headlines and not so much the United States, or not so much Japan, or not so much any other country? Industrialized, post-industrialized countries. The emerging economies are affected and impacted in a slightly different way, but they are also impacted, as you all know. And that brings me to the second element of explanation, is that the impact of this financial crisis was more obvious, more significant in the countries which were more vulnerable to it. If you take the case of Greece, or to take the case of my own country, Portugal, you will find that for different reasons, these countries were more vulnerable to some of the effects of the financial crisis than others. And the third element of explanation is to say that because these more vulnerable countries were part, and still are, part of a very integrated economic and monetary space, problems in the vulnerable individual countries, regardless of the size of their economy, are bound to become systemic problems. It's difficult to imagine that a country that shares a currency with a group of other countries, a country that shares a monetary policy with a group of other countries, the same central bank, the same set of rules, the same treaty, difficult to understand or to imagine that the problems of this country can be contained within the borders of this country and not have an impact in the system of which it is part. So the overall impact of the financial crisis, the vulnerability of some countries in particular, and the systemic impact of that vulnerability into the European Union economic and monetary union, and the European Union as a whole. As you know, within the 27 members, very soon 28 with the accession of Croatia, we will sign tomorrow the Treaty of Accession of the 28th member of the Union, which, by the way, shows the vitality of this project. We are 27 overall. Within the 27, we have 17 countries that have even closer links because they share a common currency, they have a single monetary policy. But they are part of a group of countries that have chosen a few decades ago to share sovereignty, to bring their sovereignties together, to transfer part of that sovereignty to federal or European institutions, and to build a common future together. So where are we today as we speak, as our leaders prepare to enter the building and start having dinner and then certainly a long meeting after that? We are at a point in which we need to consolidate a number of responses that we have provided to this crisis, but also a point in which we realize that we need to go further. We need to make further steps in order to address the problems that we are facing. So what have we done up to now? I believe we have done a lot in the last year, 18 months. And we have done it particularly in response to very urgent needs. The situation in Greece, of course, comes to mind as the most obvious one, but there are a few others that we had to deal with. And my first point in describing what we have done up to now is to say that we have taken unprecedented action. We have created new mechanisms, new crisis mechanisms. You have heard about the European facility, you have heard about the European stability mechanism, you've heard about a number of instruments that we created that did not exist before this crisis. The European Economic and Monetary Union was not fully equipped to deal with this particular kind of crisis. So we responded by creating new mechanisms, which were supposed to be temporary mechanisms. We have in the meantime decided to make them a permanent feature of our design. We have allocated unprecedented financial means to come to the rescue of the countries more vulnerable in difficulty. We have done that together with the International Monetary Fund, which means also in coordination with the United States, as we are both prominent members of the IMF. We have also addressed issues of governance inside the Economic and Monetary Union, because we realized that we were not fully equipped to take decisions with the speed and the efficiency and effectiveness required by this type of crisis. And we've done a lot more to address what was and still is a particularly difficult situation. So against the background of everything that we have done up to now, in the last few months, what remains to be done? What do we need to do more? Well, we realize today that the only way forward for the Economic and Monetary Union, the 17, as much as for the 27, is not to move backwards, but rather to move forward. And what you have today in Europe, what my leaders will be discussing in a few moments, is not how to go back in history, is not how to destroy, how to do differently from what we have done before, is rather how far and how fast do we want to move forward? How far do we want to go, and how fast do we want to move in that progress towards further European integration? That point is already clear as they start the meeting. The only way is forward. Now, we are 27 or 17 independent countries. We are not a federal state. We are not like the United States. We are 27 independent countries that have decided to share a great deal of their sovereignty, but they still remain independent and autonomous. They still have a parliament, they still have government and opposition, they still have a public opinion, and they are very keen to preserve that. And our project is not about abolishing nation states. Our project is about bringing them together for their own interest, to promote and defend their own interests in a better and more efficient way. But you must accept that when you have 27 independent autonomous countries, they all have a say, they all have a right to have an opinion, and in order for us to move forward, we need to create a consensus around this group. So it takes a little bit more time than if you were a single country, although even in single countries, not referring necessarily to the US, sometimes it takes a bit of time to find a consensus. It takes time for different parties to get together and agree on measures, even if the measures are absolutely necessary. And if largely everybody agrees on the diagnosis of the problem. And also, as I said earlier, because the crisis has affected all of us, we share most of these problems. Debt, deficit, imbalances in public finances. We share all that. In Europe, we are, I believe, taking the lead in addressing these structural problems, which were exacerbated by the financial crisis. Some of them were there before. Some of them were there before the crisis. Some appeared with the crisis, and some were exacerbated by the crisis. But they are there. We are dealing with them. But we are dealing with them in a context of 27 countries, 27 democracies. So, discussion today, most likely tomorrow, is what are we going to do to move forward in the European integration process, and in doing so, providing answers to the problems that we have today. So you have a number of ideas on the table. I won't go into the detailed discussion that is happening. You have ideas from single countries, you have ideas from groups of countries. You have a particularly important contribution from Germany and France. You have contributions from the European institutions. My two presidents put forward a paper 2 days ago that provides a number of ideas and solutions. The debate will be about all this. How are we going to move forward in strengthening the European Union in order to provide the right answers to the problems that we face today? A final word about how this interacts with the United States. We had just a week ago a US summit in the White House, and I witnessed a very interesting discussion between President Obama on one side, President Van Rompuy and President Barroso on my side, about exactly where the world economy is today, what's happening in the US, and most of all, what's happening in Europe today. And President Obama expressed his full solidarity, support, but also concern about the situation in Europe, which we fully understand. And our leaders were able to have a good exchange, my leaders explaining the context in Europe, which is sometimes a bit complex and difficult to understand on this side of the Atlantic. President Obama provided some elements of understanding of the situation on this side of the Atlantic, which is sometimes difficult to understand for us, I must accept. And the conclusion was, and these are my words, not their words, but I think the conclusion was, we are in this together. If there is one lesson that this financial crisis has made us aware of, is that in a globalized world economy, where we are so interconnected and interdependent, there is no such thing as a European problem or an American problem or a Chinese problem. There are different intensities of situations, but fundamentally, we can only find solutions for these problems if we work together. That's the spirit that led to the creation of the G20 leaders process. That's the spirit that motivates people inside international organizations like the IMF for this particular purpose. And that's what I found in the summit last week, is the sense that of common purpose, common interest in finding solutions. That explains also the visit of Secretary Geithner to Europe these last few days. And at the end of the day, I believe that Europe will find its way. Europe and the US and other partners international will find a way forward. because we both share one objective. We need more growth. We need to be able to create more jobs in our economies. We need to be able to address the issue of the competition coming from the emerging economies, the opportunities that the emerging economies are creating for us. We need to address imbalances in our societies, from demographics to public finances, to the skills gap, to the issue of immigration. All this brings us together. So my final word in this introduction in a World Affairs Council meeting is to say that Europe is doing its homework, sometimes difficult because of our own complex context and structure, but Europe is taking on its own responsibilities. We want to do it together with you, the Americans, and other partners around the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for that presentation and setting the table, as it were. It's, your words are very encouraging, and I think those of us here in America fully appreciate and understand that the European leadership is in total focus and doing its best to resolve these very difficult problems. And no country today seems to have easy problems, so we certainly understand the difficulty in coming to resolutions and coming to consensus of a fleeting goal. But I want to introduce one of my colleagues on the World Affairs Council of DC, board member, and that is Michael Maybach. And Michael is the president and CEO of the European American Business Council. And as such, Michael keeps up on all the happenings in Europe and all over the world, to be quite frank, and is one of the most current and savvy individuals of the occurrences and the pressures from a business perspective in terms of relationships with international events. So, Michael, if you would, you have a few words and a few contexts to give today.
Thank you very much, Raul. And Ambassador, honored to see you again and be with you on this venue. My role this afternoon is to try to give a company's perspective. The European American Business Council, our office is one block away, and we also have an office in Brussels. It's been around for about 20 years. We have 75 member companies, about half are European-based, half North American-based, mostly U.S. And so these comments reflect my thinking rather than theirs specifically, but I meet with them each and every day. I spent the last 3 days in Silicon Valley with 7 or 8 of our companies, just came in this morning for this. So these thoughts are going to be about what's at stake for these companies in the sovereign debt crisis or the euro crisis, what they see as the promise and potential of the European Union for them and their companies and markets, what they'd like to see happen, what they think will happen. I'll share some of those thoughts in the context of the ambassador's very thoughtful remarks. First is, if you look at the U.S. and Europe together, it's only 11% of the world's people, but it's over half of the GDP of the world, a high percentage of the investment in the world, and over half of the global trade. So just 11% of the world's people producing an awful lot of the wealth for a long time, really, on the planet. The United States needs more than ever foreign investment, as you know, more jobs. 70% of the investment we get invested here in the United States comes from European-based companies. In addition, European markets are number one in the aggregate, the number one market we have in the world. Therefore, our largest customer and our largest investor has a financial problem that's been on the front page of the Wall Street Journal for the last 3 or 4 months for a reason, which is there's an awful lot at stake. I'll give you one example. IBM has 400,000 employees around the world, one of our companies, 100,000 in the US, 100,000 in Europe, and the other 200,000 in all kinds of other places around the world. But half of IBM is just in these 2 places with 11% of the world's people. Now, what do companies want? They want a successful Europe. Europe started out, the EU, if you will, in the Treaty of Rome in 1957 as a peace process, not at its core a common market. That was one of the instruments of peace in addition to the euro. It's been successful in peace since the Second World War, and we want that to continue and this to be a very robust commercial market and partner for us. We'd like more of Europe, and what I mean by that is we want a single market. As the ambassador said, there's 27 member states, 28 apparently Croatia will sign up, and yet we have still a stratified or atomized market in too many ways. We have 27 patent systems, we'd like to have one. We have 27 digital markets, if you will, for download. We like to have a single digital market. We like to have an interoperable insurance market. So if you live in Italy and you get transferred to Spain, does your annuities and other things that you have in insurance policies in Italy move to that part of the European Union, of that country? We'd like to have a single privacy law. What we have now is a directive from Brussels, but we have 27 iterations of that directive. And we would like to have other things in the market, like the end of copyright collecting societies, where half of the EU members collect copyright levies on the sale of ICT equipment and half don't. And we would like to have those fade away. And at the core, we'd like the Eurozone to solve not only the financial challenges we read about every day, but to look at what the basis or the impetus of those caused problems are. I would like to identify 5 primary causes of the financial or economic problems of Europe today, and I think these are reflective of our own problems in America, so I'm not trying to be hypercritical. I'm trying to add some value to our thinking because we have some of these. One is that, as you know, Otto von Bismarck really invented the modern social welfare system in the 1890s when he came up with the world's first pension system and healthcare system. And this was really to combat his competitors on the left, if you will. So we've had all through the machine age now a 120, 130-year-old model that, because of the second issue, which is demographics, is now not helping us stay financially strong. And we talk about this every day in the United States as well. We have a social welfare model combined with European demographics. There's no country in Europe that's replacing its population. We're at 2.1 here. I think the European average is 1.7. Italy is 1.37, the lowest in recorded history. You really can't have these kind of long-term successful models without having a realistic view of demographics. The third thing is the shadow economy. There are, in some countries that are having problems today, like Greece and Italy and others, the avoidance of taxes by citizens, by companies. And when you have that, when you have wealth creation without everybody's being part of funding government, this becomes a fundamental and not just in a sort of a partial part of the problem. The fourth thing is frozen labor mobility. The largest employer today in France are temp agencies in aggregate. You have 50% unemployment in Spain among young people. What happens in those countries is that because it's so difficult to ever lay someone off or downsize because of economic realities of that business, that they add temporary employees rather than full-time because they know it's a marriage, if you will, that they're with that employee for an awfully long time unless they want to go through a very expensive and tedious process to downsize their businesses. Without change in labor mobility, you're not going to fix some of these things. And the final thing is wage levels. The Germans went through major restructuring of their social welfare model. They raised their retirement age. They did other things. And they also had deals with their unions where they scaled back and really focused on success for all of enterprises. You have some wage levels in some of the countries that are, especially in the headlines today, that really don't have competitive wage models and don't have competitive tax systems. What do the companies expect to happen? I think they expect to happen what is happening now, which is a very important summit of all the heads of state. They're a little concerned, especially in the reporting, I think, that all the focus is on where are we going to transfer money from to? Is this a transfer union? Is Germany going to either buy bonds from Italy, or are we going to have the ECB, the European Central Bank, buy more bonds and have more empowerment to do that, etc.? All these things have to be discussed. Does the IMF play a role, for example? But if we don't also embrace the significant reforms and restructuring that I've just touched on, you're just going to deal with moving the problem down the road rather than the fundamentals. So EU summits won't, in the end, reduce this level of irritation to the economic system unless each of these nations' governments, the nation states, deal with some of the policies they're in charge of. They're in charge of health care and pension and wage laws and taxation collection, those sorts of things. And I'll just sum up then with a list of the kind of things companies are interested in seeing on the table, debated in Europe, in these 27 capitals as we go forward. One, of course, is that the Maastricht Treaty in 1992 required that anyone in the euro stay within a 3% deficit per year and 60% of their GDP deficit overall, or total debt of the country. And as you know, I think virtually everybody, or at least the major countries, are all beyond the 60%. US is 87 or 90, something like that. But Italy got up to 100%. Greece, I think, 180 at one point. Number two, I think the whole idea in the West of working until you're 60 or 62, or maybe in Greece to you're 55 or whatever the retirement age is, and then you go from working 40 or 60 hours a week to nothing, has to be changed in our thinking. We have to have lifelong learning, but also lifelong contributing. And so if a person is a radiologist, and when they get to be 62 or 65 years old, maybe they're not working 40 hours a week anymore, but maybe at least in the morning they can read x-rays at their computer at home, whether it's for a local hospital or one in China, to get some digital exports in the medical field, which is a whole other panel we could have. If we allow them to do that, we empower them to do that, and encourage people to do that, we're going to get more benefit from these aging populations. Pension reform, certainly in this country and in Europe, has to be looked at. Lower rates, but effective rates that are collected. The US has the highest corporate tax rate in the world. Some companies don't pay some taxes because of exemptions and clauses in the tax code. There's a big debate here. Same thing as in Europe. A central issue in Europe has to be labor mobility. If we cannot move people from company A to company B, we really won't be competitive with the rest of the world. When I started with Intel Corporation in 1983, we had 8,000 people. I came from Caterpillar that had, I think, 40 or 50,000 people. And today, Intel has 90,000 employees. Companies do grow, and they take people. When International Harvester went out of business, maybe some of them go to a place like Intel. We have to allow companies to die, to lay off people, to stay healthy, et cetera. And that has to become something that Europe faces. Healthcare costs, they're 10% of the GDP in Europe and going up. They're 15 or 17% here. At some point, we have to connect some price signals to healthcare cost, at least for the day-to-day, not for catastrophic, but I think for the day-to-day. If not, I think at some point, given the demographics, we just won't be able to afford this and to do other things like national defense and education and all the other good things government does. More macroeconomic, and this is my penultimate comment, a macroeconomic comment is that in Europe, there are governments that now consume, this is at all levels of that particular government, 40 to 50% of GDP. And the US is now heading toward 42% of GDP, federal, state, and local spending. I would suggest to you that in Western economies, whether it's Europe or the United States, if we're going to compete with China and India and Brazil and Russia and all the rest, with aging populations, and the kind of social models that we have, we're going to have to find ways to move much closer to 30 or 35% of GDP going to government than 50%. Because at some point, we have in effect the portfolio of a middle-aged or a person on the way to retirement if you think about percentage of GDP as your stock and bond portfolio. You really need to have a change in the thinking of that. And I think I'll end there, and thank you very much.
Ambassador, would you care to comment on some of the points that Mike brought up?
Thank you. Thank you, Mike. I think it was quite impressive, the range of issues, and quite demanding for European leaders. So I didn't take note, but maybe it's taking note, and my head still can take a few notes. And I think your main message is a clear one. You want, and I fully agree with you, you want short-term measures to be followed or accompanied by more structural long-term reforms. And this is what we are exactly doing. And as I said earlier, our societies, our economies, be it the US or the EU, have to have the courage of adapting to a totally new worldwide situation. They have to implement reforms that are sometimes painful. They have to adapt themselves to a new paradigm of competition around the world. This is sometimes difficult in our societies because people are used, they take for granted what they've had up to now, and it's always difficult to produce change. What we're doing in Europe, if I may say so, is trying to take advantage of this crisis in order to implement some of these reforms. And if you look at all our countries, they all need to reform. Some have done more in the past, some are lagging behind, but they all have to do an effort. And what we're trying to do is to use the opportunity of a crisis to implement and to accelerate the implementation of these reforms. You talked about pension reform, crucial in all our countries because of demographics, because of the financial imbalances that we have inbuilt in our system. You take a look at the countries that are, implementing these new programs. You take the case of Greece, and you see a pension reform which was practically impossible to implement in normal times because the political system was blocked. And I could give you a number of other examples. It has to do with labor law. It has to do with the role of the state in the economy. It has to do with vested interest. It has to do with corruption here and there. It has to do a lot with bureaucracy. So all of this we need to address. But even more fundamentally, we need to address the issue of skills gap, the issue of innovation. We cannot lose sight of what comes after the tunnel. We need to focus on the light at the end of the tunnel. After austerity, we need growth and we need job creation. Austerity doesn't make any sense. Sacrifices don't make any sense if people don't see the light at the end of the tunnel, the possibility for their children and grandchildren to have a better life. And again, I'm describing the situation in Europe, but I don't think I'm too far away from the debate in the United States, which has to respond fundamentally to some, if not most, if not all, of these problems. We have in Europe some specificities which are linked to the way we are organized, and I described that earlier. The fact that we are a set of independent nations, the fact that we have systems in common makes things more difficult. But at the heart of the discussion is fundamentally the way industrialized, post-industrialized countries adapt to a new world reality.
Let me sort of go a little bit more fundamentally, and maybe you can help us, Ambassador. Let's remember that the European Union is a currency union. If you liken it to the United States, our currency union in the US, along with our integration, works in large measure because employees can leave Alabama, for example, if there's unemployment, and then go to work in New York or Chicago or Silicon Valley if that's where the jobs are. It's hard to imagine 7 million Greeks going to work in Germany. So what's the thinking, Ambassador, on those kinds of broad issues that people are pointing out?
Thank you. We touch upon one fundamental issue. Did we have, or do we have now already, a fully fledged economic and monetary union? And I think the reply to this question is no. We are not yet at the point where we are a fiscal union, like you are. We are not yet at the point where labor flows normally across a continent like you do here. We are not at that level of development, and we should not be judged upon criteria which cannot apply to a system which is at a lower level of sophistication. So I think what this crisis reveals is the need for us to strengthen the E of the EMU, the economic pillar of the economic and monetary union. We started with a monetary pillar by having a single currency, a central bank, one monetary policy. But we were very far, we still are, quite far from a truly economic union, in the sense that fiscal policies, budgetary policies, economic policies, whatever you call it, are more convergent and certainly cannot be divergent. And what we have seen in the past in the economic and monetary union since the arrival of the euro was that on the economic pillar there was an excessive degree of divergence among countries, which of course create an imbalance if at the same time, as you rightly say, they all are bound by the same monetary policy. The issue of devaluation, it may seem a solution, it may be a temptation, but we know from history that devaluation is not a solution, a long-term solution, a structural solution for any problem of any economy. Sooner or later, the reality will catch up, and the reality will prove that it was a short-lived sensation of a solution of a problem. It is not the solution. So we believe that the issue is not that one. The issue is rather that inside the economic and monetary union, we developed mechanisms that strengthen the economic pillar. It's the whole purpose of the measures that we have been taking, the purpose of some of the measures discussed today and tomorrow in Brussels is exactly to bring the countries closer together in terms of fiscal policy, budgetary policy, economic policy as a whole.
One of the most immediate issues is the solvency of European banks, and then the related dependency of U.S. banks, because U.S. banks, although they may not hold European sovereign debt in Greece or Portugal, they do hold. We have over 200 billion, according to one figure that I read, of debt that's issued by French and German banks, for example. So one of the issues is what is going to happen if the bonds, the sovereign debt, the sovereign bonds of Greece and Southern Europe, let's just say, and in Ireland, continue to go down, and their rate and their yield continues to go up. In other words, they're very expensive, and they're essentially being diminished in value. And that's the way the market is reacting. Are American companies worried about that? Mike, can you add to that, and then maybe the ambassador can help us as well?
That's a very good question. The banks play a very unique role in this capitalistic system because they are the circulatory system. They're moving dollars or euros or whatever the currency is from where it was to where it needs to be to have the highest value. And that function needs to be well managed by those banks. It needs to be well regulated, not more or less regulation. I really think these discussions about let's have more or less regulation misses the point. It's really let's have smart regulation. The concern of our companies is where they're going to get their lines of credit, whether you're a small bakery or you're Vodafone, and how you're going to move money back and forth in your subsidiaries if your partner has been Deutsche Bank, and then Deutsche Bank just lost billions on Italian bonds because they defaulted, or the Greeks have already taken a 50% haircut on their bonds. In the end, the real fear of companies is that we'll have enough defaults on bonds or inability to sell some of those bonds that banks, especially in Europe, will have too much weakness financially. You'll start to see, I mean, this is a worst case scenario, people in Greece lining up in front of banks like we had in the late 20s in this country, which we called run-on banks. And if that happens, other countries read those same headlines, and this starts to happen. And this becomes an unraveling of the strength of the capital system. So the relationship between what's going on in Brussels this evening and tomorrow and their communication and coordination with the thoughtful leaders of the banking industry are really important relationships to make sure are firm. They don't want to have a disconnect with the banking system. Our companies are doing very well by and large. There's lots of profitability in them, but they're concerned about future growth and really a lost decade if we're not careful across the ocean here and in the United States as well longer term.
Banks have been at the central stage of this financial crisis. It, in fact, officially started with the fall of one bank over here in the United States, as we are well known. So they've been throughout this process at the center of the storm. And we have, since the early days of this crisis, agreed that we should provide an international response to this, because banks are global operators. And one of the axes of the action inside the G20 was exactly that, to look at ways and means to prevent another crisis of this kind to appear again, to happen again. There was a lot about regulation, because we found out at the beginning of this crisis that the regulation did not work. Our systems of supervision and regulation of the banking system simply did not work in the appropriate way. And we had to redress that. And there was a huge effort internationally to revamp the whole universe of supervision and regulation of the banking activity. And we are very far down the road in that. We have not yet finished our job, and we still have things to do on both sides of the Atlantic and elsewhere to achieve that. But this has been a fundamental drive. Closer to where we are today, the issue has been one of recapitalization as a major tool to enable the banks to perform their role, and the issue of funding, of providing liquidity for the real economy. We are addressing both of them in the present set of measures that we are implementing and the discussion we are having in Europe. So, but as Mike said, the banks are central, crucial for economic activity. We need to find the right solution. They are not easy to implement, but again, they have to be implemented having fully in mind the world dimension of the banking activity today.
One of our audience members has asked, in Europe, is there an ultimate last creditor? And I think what he means by that is sort of the creditor of last resort of sorts.
You have to understand that any solution for the present difficulties we have has to be has to include a number of elements, right? We are not talking about one measure here, one measure there. We're talking about what we are now calling a compact of measures that address different concerns and different issues. And you also have to consider that we need to address issues of short term, very short term. When the markets open on Monday morning in Asia, they have to have some kind of sense of where Europe is moving. But there is a longer term, which is also crucial. We talked about the competitiveness of our economies, very important. We're talking about the stability of the euro area, very important. And these are not issues for Monday or Tuesday, these are issues for longer term. But we also have to think about the political dimension of things. These are not technicalities. We are touching on issues that are central to a national sovereignty, issues that are central to the public opinion interests, issues that are central to the political discussion. We're talking about currency, monetary policy, the economy, jobs, companies, the lives of millions of people around Europe. So you need to bring together a set of conditions that allow whatever decision we take to be implementable, sustainable on the long term, also on political grounds. So you need to have a composition of measures that, a bouquet, as the French would say, that brings together different elements that allow the decisions to be politically sustainable as much as technically sound. This is the issue that we are discussing. That's why it's so difficult, because you have public opinions in different member states having different concerns. You have different sort of roles played by different member states in this process that need to be addressed. And at the heart of that will be the role of the ECB and the role of the central monetary policy in this system.
There's a proposal that's been publicized that has the so-called golden rule. And if I understand it correctly, and one never knows if you're reading the correct description from the newspapers, is that there would be a mechanism, an agreement among either the 17 or the full 27, 28 members, that there are limits, as you said earlier, to the deficit amount, which could only be 3%, I believe, and the overall amount of debt to the GDP would be 60% or something. But then the interesting thing from my perspective and from many is that what's the enforcement? Apparently the European Court of Justice or some other body like that would make some findings, and then there might be some sanctions of some sort, which are intentionally vague. And I realize your leaders are working on that, but is that a fair way to describe something that's on the table that's being discussed? And if you could give us examples of how that might be enforced without obviously
you're
predicting.
touching upon the issues that we raised earlier, which is how do we move from the present situation in which our economic and monetary union, that is the 17 countries that share the euro, to simplify, how do we move from the present situation where this economic and monetary union is not perfect, and how do we move to making it closer to perfect? Right. In the sense that it becomes closer to what you would call here a fiscal union. We have, the figures you mentioned are already there, and they've been there since the beginning of the euro. We had the Stability and Growth Pact that was supposed to implement those rules. What we have realized now is that the set of rules, the mechanisms for implementation, for enforcement of these principles were not fully effective. They have not been effective. Otherwise, we would not have had the situation we have in some of our most vulnerable countries. So the question is, how do we move from a situation which did not provide the right framework for this to be achieved to one that is more reliable in doing so? And that's why we have this discussion about what kind of enforcing mechanism. Should it be in the treaty in a more forceful way? If it is in the treaty, is it a treaty among the 17 that are only in the euro area, or is it a treaty covering the 27? Is it fully necessary to have a revision of the treaty, full-fledged revision, or can we do it through other mechanisms, achieving the same effectiveness and efficiency? That's a debate we're having these days also in Brussels. Let's see what comes out of the discussion. But the common purpose of all these initiatives and ideas is to try to be more effective in implementing common rules, so that our economic and monetary union is more consistent and does not, in the future, have to deal with the same kind of situations that we have today. But there are many ideas on the table. We'll see what the consensus will focus on.
Mike, is there a view from your companies about this?
The ambassador, I think, created a good picture of the situation. I think one of the central questions we face is, while the Eurozone of 17 countries tries to figure out a way forward, which I think is going to be some sort of budgetary caps with teeth, if you will, on national budgets. So you can envision now 17 parliaments told, you'll still work out your national budget, but you'll be told what the top of that total dollar amount, or euro amount in this case, is going to be. And so that's not a loss of sovereignty in setting priorities, but it's a loss in sovereignty in being able to deficit spend, if you will. And there's some people that would like that in Europe, and businesses certainly have to live by things like that. I do think that that movement of the 17 having an even firmer sort of currency union does put into question the other now 18 with Croatia, and what relationship they'll have. You remember that one of the reasons the UK joined the EU was they wanted a common market. And you look at Sweden, they voted not to have the euro. Poland doesn't have the euro yet, and as you know, there's a lot of people in some of these countries that haven't adopted it yet, are now leery of getting into the euro until they see how this is going to work out. So I think one of the questions will be, can they frame a system that allows for national sovereignty for 17 parliaments, but with caps? And number two, what will that do to the rest of the common market in terms of now two sets of rules in a bit stronger way? And maybe that's over sketching that, but I think that will be some debate you'll hear about.
We're touching upon the heart of the matter here, in a way, because if you look at Europe today, we will have to find the right balance between discipline, that's what we're talking about, and convergence. We don't want discipline that accentuates or aggravates divergence. We want discipline as a tool to bring countries closer together, the same levels of development. But we also need to find the right balance between responsibility and solidarity. You know, countries need to be responsible in the management of their public finances, but there has to be solidarity from the others. And thirdly, we need to find the right balance between financial stability, which is of course a good thing, with growth. It doesn't make sense to be financially stable and getting poorer and poorer. We need to find the right balance between the required stability, but the possibility to grow and to create jobs for our people and to improve the competitiveness of our economies.
Very, very well said. Well, unfortunately, we're out of time. And so with that, I'll end the program. I'll thank you again for your great efforts. Mike, thank you for your contributions today. Heidi and the rest of the World Affairs Council, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us for World Affairs Today, a production of the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C. Stay connected with us at www.worldaffairstoday.org.